I was born and raised in Sri Lanka, and I spent almost the first 21 years of my life there. And then I moved to the US to undertake my bachelor's and master's degrees in aerospace engineering. Yeah, that's pretty much my background. I was always interested in aerospace, and I was always interested in engineering. I always knew I was going to be an engineer. So that was the perfect harmony. That was the perfect mixture of both of them. Since I was a kid, I always wanted to come to New Zealand. It's a very beautiful and peaceful country, and I always wanted to come here. So I thought doing a PhD here would be the perfect excuse to be here. So my research will be focusing on the plasma instabilities that take place in magnetic nozzles and how we can predict and model them. So my goal is to better understand these instabilities. What is the physics behind this, and how can we model them? How can we predict them? So engineers and scientists can prepare to mitigate and minimize the negative impacts these have on the thrusters. And this becomes especially important because the world becomes more and more interested in exploring aerospace. So building very efficient thrusters has become a very high priority in the world of aerospace engineering. So this is a very timely research topic. So this will help to create very efficient thrusters that could take us further and further and further. And also it will be favorable also in terms of cost efficiency and resources and everything. So it'll create overall a much more efficient thrust system, or it will help to create a much more efficient thrust system. Yeah, so whenever I do visit Robinson, it's just nothing but professionalism. The people that were working there were very enthusiastic, very friendly, very welcoming, and they were very keen to explain to me exactly what's going on, how long they've been working on it, what's the progress, and what's the end goal of it. So you can see that they're very enthusiastic and very energetic, and they just love being there. So it's a very professional environment. It's a very good environment. So if you want to work there, if you want to study there, you shouldn't think twice about it. So yeah, I think Robinson is a very good place that pretty much puts New Zealand on the world map in terms of these kinds of this high-level research that are not being explored widely.